we don't really push the envelope. More like open it. This is Litopia, After Dark. The net's first and foremost literary salon. A feast of ideas for your hungry mind. So pull up a chair and let's talk.
I've got so much left to say, I'll take my words and walk away.
Good evening and welcome to Litopia After Dark. Tonight we demonstrate that truth is indeed stranger than fiction. Alexander Litvinenko was murdered just down the road from where I am now, and a mere stone's throw away from the US Embassy. That was in 2006. 7 years later, the inquest is at last scheduled to begin in a few weeks' time. The case is baroque in its complexity. Frederick Forsyth, one of the world's most famous thriller writers, who rose to fame with The Day of the Jackal, you may recall, has said his publisher would never believe such an unrealistic plotline. And best-selling author Andy McNabb says that trying to explain the story to publishing folk would take all day. It would confuse everybody, he says. Nevertheless, that's what we're going to do tonight, with the help of the man who wrote the definitive book on the topic, New York Times special correspondent Alan Cowell. So suspend your disbelief as we enter the shadowy world of billionaire oligarchs, international assassins, and triple agents on tonight's edition of Litopia After Dark.
It's time to discuss weighty matters, to weight up momentous issues, to thrash out the business that is book. We're erudite, we're witty, we're urbane. We are Litopia After Dark.
Oh, yes we are. Alan Cowell, welcome. You've written books about South Africa under apartheid and novels about war correspondence and foreign correspondence. What possessed you to write about the Litvinenko affair, and be honest, have you ever regretted it?
I've never regretted it. I remember when I started writing it, I thought, well, maybe here I'm going into uncharted waters. I don't want to mix, well, it's the same metaphor, am I out of my depths? And you don't know if you start writing about the successor agencies to the KGB. Yeah. You're living in London. It's the center of KGB, former KGB, FSB operations outside of Moscow, whether you're making yourself vulnerable to some kind of reprisal. So there was a degree of looking over my shoulder. I was concerned. I went to Moscow to interview the man who was finally accused of killing Alexander Litvinenko. That was a fairly scary encounter too. And so I think that although I would say that although there were certainly moments when I worried about whether I'd bitten off more than I could chew, that I certainly never regretted embarking on this venture.
Because to be serious, I mean, journalists have been killed, haven't they? Quite a lot of journalists, actually, over the past few years.
Well, particularly in Russia. They've mainly been, there's only been one foreign journalist to my knowledge, but a lot of the Committee for the Protection of Journalists and a lot of advocacy groups, journalist groups, do rank Russia pretty high in the list of those countries where the job is dangerous. So
when you accepted our invitation to come along here tonight, was your heart in your mouth?
Oh, absolutely. I didn't know who you guys were, and I still don't, I mean...
Have there been any threats against your life, Alan?
Not that I'm aware of. Certainly, if you were being watched by a professional, international intelligence agency, would you know? I doubt it very much.
Have you felt moments of paranoia where you've thought that someone's following you or anything of that regard? We are in serious professional espionage territory, so the question, I hope, is valid.
Well, to research the book, I was moving in circles where you met people whose background was not immediately clear, who wanted to obfuscate where they were coming from, what they were about, what they knew, what they didn't know. They live in a world where information is gold, and if you've got a little snippet that goes their way, that might help them move it in some other area that you don't even know about. So, of course, paranoia is fairly is a what can I say? It's part
endemic.
of the trade, yeah.
Now, this is suddenly turning into quite a hot area again, isn't it? Because Warner Brothers apparently have snapped up film rights. Johnny Depp is slated to play the protagonist. I mean, how's all that going?
Well, as far as I know, there is a script, there is a studio approval for the script, and we have... there have been various directors mentioned. I'm not sure that Johnny Depp's still involved, but certainly it's not as far as I know, the project is still remotely alive somewhere in Hollywood.
Of course, the inquest starts on the 1st of May this year, and that is very likely to reignite international interest in this long-running case, isn't it?
Well, the inquest is the first and only time so far that the players in this investigation will be obliged to testify under oath about what they know. And some of the most important players have never had to do that before. The British police, the intelligence services. This will be a unique opportunity to try and unravel what happened beyond what we've been able to establish by our own diligence.
Well, Pete and myself, and I'm sure the chat room, have tons of questions for you, but if you could walk us through the basics of the story, starting with who was Litvinenko?
Sure. Alexander Litvinenko was a former KGB officer. When the KGB was replaced by the FSB, he became an officer of the FSB. He was in charge of a unit that was investigating organized crime in Russia. He fled after an argument with the man who was to become president, Vladimir Putin, become president twice, in fact. In 2000, he took up residence in Britain. He became a British citizen in 2006. He'd been a whistleblower. He'd been, some people had called him a gadfly. He'd been in this world of information gathering, of not really, it's not espionage, but I think the term would be risk assessment, risk analysis, that kind of, it's a very murky world. A lot of former intelligence and serving intelligence people gravitate to it. He'd been part of this world. He became a British citizen with his family, his wife, Marina, his teenage son, Anatoly, in 2006. And weeks later, this whole episode actually began. He was taken to hospital in North London, near where he lived, in Muswell Hill. They couldn't work out what was wrong with him. Would a doctor or a nurse on duty in a North London hospital believe somebody who said, "Look, I'm a former KGB agent.
Exactly.
The Kremlin did this to me."
He'd been the psychiatric
Psych ward,
exactly.
right away.
So immediately,
That's what happened to me.
but in fact, let's not forget that Alexander Litvinenko, since his time in Moscow, had a very, very important sponsor, a friend, employer, who was the oligarch Boris Berezovsky.
Now, Boris Berezovsky is one of, as you say, one of the oligarchs. And let's just explain what
A major character in this tale.
Huge person, a person of vast wealth. Now, the oligarchs arose because when Russia dispensed with communism, it decided to go all the way, and it sold off everything, didn't it? And I believe at the time, in the 1990s, it's something like 24 oligarchs suddenly owned about half of Russian economic assets.
Also, to add to that, I've read that 90%, when the curtain came down, when the Iron Curtain came down, 90% of new business applications were made by former Secret Service KGB agents.
Well, I think certainly Boris Berezovsky had been a maths professor at the university in Moscow. He had not been a business. He likes to say that he started in business simply by the fact that a lot of Russians liked Mercedes cars. So he'd fly to Germany, he'd buy second-hand Mercedes, he'd make sure they were driven to Moscow, and he sold them at a great profit. He ended up, of course, taking over the biggest car company in Moscow, in Russia, along with a whole lot of other businesses. The essence of an oligarch is someone who's got a foot in both business and the political camp, and Boris Berezovsky, by his own account, was very close opposed to Boris Yeltsin, the president before Vladimir Putin.
Who presided, and it was Yeltsin who presided over this massive sell-off, wasn't it, of the stock?
Oh, indeed. And,
Yes.
and people were buying, they were able to buy into what had been state companies for the 70 years of the revolution at fire sale prices.
But certainly things like media companies and oil and gas rights, mineral rights, went for a song to former Secret Service employees.
There was a close connection, indeed, between the organs of state power and what became a private sector. Yeah, sure.
So you've suddenly got vast wealth creation, just enormous amounts of wealth, and along with that, as always, inevitably, there's corruption. But to begin with, Berezovsky, who was, quite a significant person in this story, was an ally of Putin, wasn't he?
Indeed. There are various points in Boris Berezovsky's career when he's seen very clearly to be sponsoring and throwing the weight of his media empire behind first Boris Yeltsin and then Vladimir Putin. But when Putin took power, he made it very, very clear to the oligarchs that their days were over in the way they'd been running things up until then, that they could certainly amass large amounts of money, but their political influence was over, and some of the oligarchs went along with that, and some resisted, and Boris Berezovsky fell out very severely with Vladimir Putin, and in the year 2000, he wasn't far behind Alexander Litvinenko in arriving in the UK and seeking asylum.
So what was the essential connection between Litvinenko, I'm having problems pronouncing these names, you do it much better than I do, and Berezovsky?
Litvinenko had been the investigating officer in an attempt on Berezovsky's life in Moscow, and that brought the two together. And he then became quite a habitué at the sort of salon that Boris Berezovsky held in an upscale mansion in Moscow.
So you said that Alexander Litvinenko had a falling out with Vladimir Putin, which is part of the reason that he left Russia and came to the UK. Did that have anything to do with bear wrestling?
That had bear wrestling in the broader term of corruption, maybe.
Which is, of course, what I meant.
But he certainly, there was, when Putin, remember that both Vladimir Putin and Alexander Litvinenko had risen to the same rank. They'd both been colonels in the KGB. They were equals in that sense. And when Putin became the head of the FSB, the successor to the KGB, the domestic successor, Alexander Litvinenko went to him with a list of officers he regarded to be corrupt, and he was ignored, and he fell out with Vladimir Putin.
Over a list of corrupt officers. Had nothing to do with judo.
So what actually drove Litvinenko into exile here?
He was arrested. He fought. He was arrested and acquitted on charges, and the minute he was released, he was rearrested by uniformed FSB officers and thrown back in jail. It was made very clear to him that if he stayed in Moscow, this would be his life, that he would be constantly regarded as someone to be harassed and imprisoned. And so he decided to flee, which wasn't that simple for him. His papers had been taken away from him as a result of the legal cases against him, and he fled on a very circuitous route.
You've got in London here, you've got a community of expat Russians, many of them very wealthy, I think, who find London a very congenial place to live, a fairly safe place to live. So you've got this little sub-community going on, and in it there seems to be, just from reading, continual plotting and subterfuge, and Putin seems to be pretty much the enemy who unites most of them. Is that right?
It's very varied, I think, because if you think of exiles of their nature are prone to conspiracy. It's the only way they're going to get back home. They have to plot their way back home. No one's going to let them go home, and they haven't got the physical power to push themselves back home. So conspiracy becomes a normal state. But there are two very clear groups. You have got former enemies who've come here to the UK as they have to other countries, but primarily to the UK simply because it's close and they speak the language and there is a community here of like-minded people. But against that, there are an awful lot of Russians who have come to Britain and they've given it this name Londongrad. It's for schools, housing, it's where they live. They do business back in Moscow. It's a 3.5, 4-hour flight. It's a commute, essentially. And they live here in conditions that are preferable to being in Moscow.
It's amazing for some to even contemplate this, but the weather here in London is, in fact, better.
It's quite a comparison, indeed.
So now everything really hinges on events on the day, 1st of November 2006, doesn't it? Can you tell us, even the events on that day are actually disputed, what happened and why do you think it happened?
What happened was that I think it was, from Litvinenko's point of view, it was to have been a fairly normal day. He came in to town on the bus. He had various meetings to attend to. One of them, which was the initial false trail in the whole saga, was with an Italian guy called Mario Scaramella, and he met him in the Itsu sushi joint on Piccadilly. That had nothing to do with his poisoning. He then went along to the Pine Bar of the Millennium Hotel in Grosvenor Square, just across the way from the American Embassy, and there he met with several Russians of similar backgrounds, ex-KGB, who were in town ostensibly to go to a soccer game. They had a few drinks. Litvinenko didn't drink alcohol. He drank tea. He drank tea from a pot that was brought to him. Then he went, after that meeting, he had some photocopying and he went to Boris Berezovsky's office. Another of the people Berezovsky sponsored was Ahmed Zakayev, a Chechen exile leader. They lived opposite each other across the road from one another in Muswell Hill. So
they were mates?
They're very close friends, yeah. That's part of Litvinenko's story, is his conversion from being an FSB person who would regard Chechen separatists as the enemy to a very close relationship with Chechens. He, on his deathbed, he converted to Islam, which
wow. Because that's something that struck me as interesting, because this is such a shadowy world. Alexander Litvinenko is often painted as the protagonist, to be played by Johnny Depp, but was he not involved as a KGB agent in suppressing the Chechen Revolution, for lack of a better word?
No, certainly. His first encounter with the Chechens, his first hands-on experience there was during the first Chechen War, when he was on the Russian government side.
So he
was interrogating prisoners, and there are various
So that's
accounts.
A fact. He was involved in torture of Chechen civilians.
I don't know if it was torture. I wasn't there. But
he was a KGB agent in charge of interrogating Chechen civilians.
Well, he was an officer rather than an agent, but his job was to talk to people. In fact, one of the very interesting sides of this was that when he just got to the UK, he gave a long interview to Gerald Seymour, my fellow novelist and good friend. And in that interview, Gerald, in fact, based one of his characters on Litvinenko because his notion of questioning was not fingernail pulling. It was a much more subtle combination of stick and carrot. And while his enemies will say it was all stick, certainly the impression from that interview, which I saw the transcript of, was that he had a very keen sense of how to persuade people.
So he had a nuanced interrogation technique.
That's the inference for sure.
So what was his carrot and what was his stick, as far as you know?
Well, as far as I know, I think it was just to persuade people, to befriend them, to show them that it didn't have to be, the way it was going to be. I think the stick that was generally used was the fact that a lot of these kids who were captured still had family elsewhere. And I'm not saying for 1 minute that Litvinenko would have made those threats, but they must have known that the destiny of their family would certainly hinge on their behavior under interrogation.
Okay, so here we are in the Pine Bar, 1st of November 2006, Millennium Hotel, Grosvenor Square, very, very swanky place. As I say, just a stone's throw away, barely a few yards away from the US Embassy.
Which is the only place in London where you can reliably see machine guns.
I've seen them there, actually.
Every now and again, I've got to go in and renew a passport or whatnot, and I think, a little piece of America, a little piece of home.
What happened next?
Well, what happened next was he, after that encounter with the soccer fans, he went home and he started feeling very, very ill, and he was acutely ill. He was vomiting, and he was in deep distress. He was in a lot of pain, and he was taken to a local hospital where no one could figure out, what exactly was wrong with him. And his slowly but surely, his story began to emerge, primarily in the UK papers. In the Sunday Times was the first one to break it. A lot more attention began to be paid to his case when it was established that he was, in fact, a former FSB officer of some stature, and he was transferred then to the bigger hospital at UCH. But the problem was that no one knew what they were looking for. They ran all the normal tests, including with a Geiger counter, which was set up to record gamma rays. But nobody, and he went from bad to worse.
They thought thallium poisoning for a time, didn't they?
They thought thallium. One of the people who went to see him was a specialist called John Henry, who was actually hired by Boris Berezovsky, and he actually played a really important role because he realized that when he shook hands to say goodbye to Litvinenko, there was no loss of strength, and if it had been thallium poisoning, he would have lost strength in his hand. So he began to think it must be something else.
So the bad sushi angle, that was actually a bit of a red herring?
Yeah, bad sushi, red herring. Yeah.
So how eventually did they detect that this was such an... I think it's the first time it's ever been used, actually, in recorded history as an assassination weapon. How did they detect that it was this particular isotope of polonium?
Because doctors are extraordinarily clever, that's how.
It was down to John Henry, who'd gone along with the thallium theory, who had accepted what he was told, that there was no radioactivity in his body. And then he suddenly started thinking, well, maybe it was something else. And at the last minute, he contacted the police and said, you've got to get the urine samples that were taken from Litvinenko. He was, and that was in fact the last opportunity they could have done, and that was taken to British laboratories, and they looked for other forms of radioactivity based on alpha rays, and they found that polonium has a very distinctive footprint. It's primarily emits alpha rays as it decays, but once every, I think, 100,000, it blips a gamma ray, and then you're dealing with polonium. And that it was never, ever supposed to be found out.
Wow.
This was, if you don't know to look for polonium, there is no way of, he would have died without anybody knowing why he died.
Amazing. I mean, fiendishly clever. What unspeakable.
Well, you say it's fiendishly clever, but it also it's a huge smoking gun, because since I knew that Alan was coming on, I've been on the internet all day trying to score some polonium-210, and no love whatsoever.
I can tell you where to buy it, actually.
Oh, good.
You can buy polonium-210, but I tell you what, only in tiny amounts.
Well, that's just it. I mean,
tiny amounts.
Well, we're talking
$65
in order to
pop.
kill someone, as I understand, we're talking the level of a picogram, like.
It's negligible. You could hardly measure it, the amount that's required.
So, Mike, how is it delivered? How do you carry it around? How do you take it on a plane? And are we talking about, because I understand you can make polonium by bombarding bismuth with neutrons, or you can take 37 tons of uranium ore and distill it down to microscopic quantities. But either one requires laboratories, requires some serious technology. How does one go about getting polonium and then transporting it and delivering it to your target for the anarchist cookbook readers among us?
Well, as my memory is, I think 97% of the world's polonium is produced in Russia. It's produced in what used to be these very secretive nuclear cities in remote places that weren't even recorded on the maps in the old Soviet days. It is produced under very, very strict conditions. It is transported under very strict conditions, and it's marketed primarily to American companies for use in reducing the static in various processes, printing processes, for instance. But it is not something that it just is out there.
You'd never look for it. You'd never look for it, would you?
But if you were looking for a poison that had killed somebody inexplicably, where would you look? But you wouldn't look. You wouldn't have looked for polonium. Now, of course, we're looking for polonium in the body of Yasser Arafat.
You know what's on television right now? Well, Litopia is the antidote.
Ali, good evening. Wait, what are your thoughts about the story so far?
I agree. I think the fascinating thing is where it came from, because clearly it was sort of set up by somebody somewhere. I also quite like to know if there have been copycat episodes. Because if this was the first ever, I mean, if it's so fantastically successful, surely somebody else has thought this is a good way of going about it.
Well, Alan was just saying that there are suggestions that Yasser Arafat was
indeed.
killed.
I mean, Yasser Arafat's body.
The half-life of polonium is so small that if they were to go back to Yasser Arafat, it will have decayed past detectable levels by now?
That's for scientists to determine. There could be some kind of tiny legacy trace if you know what to look for. But since it decays every few weeks, it loses half of its radioactive power. This is a very rapidly decaying substance. It's not like something you have to put at Sellafield.
But this is where it comes in. This is the crazy part, is if you're going to poison someone with polonium, it seems like automatically you know that it's coming from some deep dark area of Russia.
Only if you get found out.
Only if you get found out. Okay, that's fair enough. But this is sort of a high-profile former KGB agent.
Very nearly wasn't found out. We heard from Alan. I mean, the curious thing about I think it was a fiendishly clever idea to use it. But I want to ask Alan about the execution of the plan, because once they found that it was polonium, then they started to get busy, and it appears as if the people using this stuff had taken the top off and they'd sloshed it around here and there. The execution was actually messy, wasn't it?
Well, if you assume that it was transported somehow in some kind of vial in a diluted form and in a way that could be used, you have to ask whether the people who are accused by the British Crown Prosecution Service of administering this, one man in particular, whether they actually knew what was in the whatever they'd
maybe
been
they
given.
didn't know,
and maybe that wasn't known, and that wouldn't be the first time. It would be quite normal in an intelligence operation to have cutoffs, so that you know what you need to know. And
so they used a mule essentially to get it over here.
That would be
one hypothesis. How would one carry it in a Pyrex beaker? Do you carry it in metal?
I think in some kind of glass vial in a solution.
As being alpha particles, glass would be perfectly okay to shield it. It's only when it comes.
Doesn't it get enormously hot? I thought that's the whole point. Even a tiny amount gets enormously hot.
If it's not in suspension, yeah.
Again, this is we're into the area of conjecture. But how do you believe in all your research that the polonium was actually delivered to him in the tea? Was a syringe used to put it in the tea, or
I was not able to uncover any reliable account in my reporting of how exactly that happened. What I discovered was that while Litvinenko had been sickening, he'd been spending a lot of time with British detectives, and he'd been able to give them a very close working account of who he'd met, when he'd met them. Remember, he was an investigator, a trained investigator himself, so he was very familiar with how you set out your schedule, when you met them, how you met them, where you were, what time it was, how long the meeting lasted, all of these very practical steps. He had told them to a British detective with whom he clearly struck up a quite close and friendly relationship. And that didn't add up to to a hill of beans, I guess you'd say, until the use of polonium was discovered. And at that point, it was possible for investigators to put on their white suits and take their alpha ray detectors and go to all the places on this list that Litvinenko had given them. And in all of those places, polonium was found. And the highest concentration was in the Pine Bar of the Millennium Hotel and in a couple of rooms in that same hotel. So this is what was leading the investigators to put their case together.
And also on the BA flights back to Moscow, there were traces, weren't there?
There were traces on flights. But there were anomalies, don't forget. For instance, one man who hasn't been charged but was at the Pine Bar came through Hamburg. When the German police read about this in a copy of the magazine Der Spiegel, they said, wow, what's going on here? We'd better start looking for it. They found polonium everywhere this guy had been. Wow. At his ex-wife's apartment and various other places in Hamburg. I don't know how many of us go and visit ex-wives in Hamburg, but he was certainly a man who did. But there was no trace on the Germanwings flight that took him from Hamburg to London. So how do you explain that?
Well, will it always leave a trail? If I'm carrying polonium from point A to point B and I stop in a coffee shop along the way, will you be able to follow that trail?
Well, clearly it was. There are two arguments about that. One, the Russian argument is that polonium was transmitted from within his body. Because don't forget, the people who are accused of killing and plotting to kill Alexander Litvinenko themselves say that they were the victims of a polonium assassination.
Now, as I understand the nature of the polonium molecule, you can handle it. It won't go through your skin. It'll go through an open wound, but you need to ingest it.
Yes.
So if he's walking around spreading this from the places that he's been to the Pine Bar and whatnot, then it would have to be he's urinating on his way. He's very sweaty. I mean, how does the Russian argument hold? Does it hold any weight?
Well, it's there were traces at his ex-wife's apartment of polonium in a baby's diaper, a nappy. So. These we're talking about very small amounts. Clearly, the baby wasn't poisoned, but it can be. It shows up in urine.
Now, Litvinenko co-authored a book, didn't he? That may or may not, I don't know, shed some light on motives here. Can you tell us about that?
The book. He'd written a book accusing the KGB, the FSB, of responsibility for some apartment house bombings at around the time. When was that? In the late 1990s. That didn't get much traction in Russia. It singled him out. It certainly made him. He wrote that book, as I recall, after he fled to the UK.
Well, the basic idea was that his book was called Blowing Up Russia. He co-authored it. And the basic idea was that he was saying that all these bombs that had been going off in Moscow and various other cities were not actually planted by Chechen separatists, but they were planted by Russia's own security services. In other words,
in order to make
ops.
the Chechen separatists look bad.
And in order, so the argument goes, I think, Alan, to promote Putin's presidential aspirations.
Well, certainly the idea of having a tough leader who could crack down on the Chechens was part of Putin's appeal. If you remember, he was photographed in the cockpit of a warplane that was going to go on a mission over Chechnya. He's always had a penchant for these dramatic photographs of himself in a very macho guise, whether it's sort of fishing bare-chested.
Come on, we all like to take pictures of ourselves on a horse bare-chested.
I've seen your Facebook page, Ian. It's not pretty. Not pretty.
I disassociate myself from these two guys interviewing me, I have to say.
That's probably for the best.
Connection?
Yes.
Well, I'm glad.
I don't quite get the hang of that.
Well, that's a very interesting thing.
And to open that up even further, was Alexander Litvinenko employed by MI6?
These are the allegations that came out much later. Certainly at the time I was writing and researching my book, I think they were known to his widow. She was under a degree of I think she promised to the various services involved not to disclose that. The idea that he was a paid agent of MI6 is to my mind is plausible. I think Marina Litvinenko has said that there was a joint account that they had at the bank, and they got their monthly paycheck from MI6 in Vauxhall. It doesn't seem implausible to me. He was a person that if they weren't interested in, there should have been, because he had a lot of contacts. They would.
Can those deposits be forensically traced back to anything other than a shell company in, I don't know, Burkina Faso?
I'd be very surprised if they could be, but that we hope is the kind of detail we're looking to see at the inquest. And the other aspect of this, of course, which emerged several years after his death, was that at the time he was killed, he'd been closely involved with the Spanish intelligence services, and what they were looking for was evidence that linking various fugitive organized crime figures who were living in impunity in Spain, they weren't committing any offenses in Spain, to figures in the Kremlin in the perpetration of all of these criminal activities that we associate with the mafia.
At the point he's dying, then presumably he actually parted with really quite a lot of interesting information.
Well, he was convinced, wasn't he, that it was basically Putin's men?
There was never any doubt in his mind that he'd been poisoned. He didn't want initially to blame a fellow Russian because he didn't want that to come out, because he thought it might influence the investigation. His relationship with the man who was accused of by the Crown Prosecution Service of murder is quite a complicated one, because in some ways they were business partners, in some ways they'd socialized in the same circles. They'd met at, oddly enough, at Boris Berezovsky's birthday party about a year before. At
Man, that was a good party.
Sure, that was a relationship that it's hard to actually know how that worked. I went to Moscow and I interviewed the accused killer, and
a man by the name of
Andrei Lugovoy, a former KGB bodyguard, who has denied that he murdered Litvinenko, and who said that he, along with Dmitry Koptyn, was in fact targeted in a polonium plot.
Well, this is an interesting twist in the tale, in the fact that he was here, and now he's in Moscow, and now they're saying they're not going to send him back to face charges, or to... Is that true?
Well, the Russian Constitution, so we're told, does not allow the authorities to send Russians abroad to face charges.
Well, that's this. So we're told. Do you have any kind of Russian constitutional scholar that will say there's precedence for this? In fact, blah blah blah, citing code.
Any Russian constitutional scholar will tell you that they that this is that it's legally impossible to extradite him.
But he's also a member of the Duma too.
He's a member of the Duma, but that would only give him immunity from prosecution inside Russia. But still, it gives him a status that elevates him above the ordinary Russian.
But this brings us on to the question of motive. What an impossibly obscure way to kill somebody. Why would anybody do this? Now, the obvious first base answer I got to put to you, and I'm very intrigued to know what your response is simply that he was just considered to be a traitor. That spies of any colour, creed or description, former communists or Americans or whoever,
Are you suggesting it was an offhand thing?
No, that they don't like it. They really don't like it when their own turncoats. And there's precedent for this. White Russians would regularly be assassinated in France in the 1920s, 30s, 40s. Of course, Leon Trotsky, another famous revenge assassination there. George I. Markov, 1978, Bulgarian defector, killed in an equally improbable, obscure, outre way here in London. It may be...
With the poison-tipped umbrella.
Absolutely. Maybe, Alan, it is simply they just don't like turncoats.
That's one theory, and it's until anybody comes up with the definitive version... that's as plausible as others. Equally, you've got to decide, did the people who planned this want it to be discovered? If they wanted it to be discovered, then you could make the argument that, or you could say that this was a warning. This was a signal to all of those people out there who oppose the Kremlin, who oppose figures in the Kremlin, that this was the risk they were running. This is what happened if you went up against them. Equally, though, you could argue that if the idea was that this would never be found out, which is the theory I tend to tilt towards, then clearly this was a much more targeted thing. It would have that effect. He dies mysteriously. All of these people, enemies of the Kremlin in exile, know that Litvinenko, I mean, just weeks before he died, he'd been standing up at the Frontline Club in London and blaming Putin in the death of Anna Politkovskaya, a journalist who was killed just a few weeks earlier. So he was not exactly what do they call it? A shy violet.
So, twofold question here. If I were to write a book on, the KGB blowing up apartments, how much would my life insurance policy go up per month? And how did this story play in Moscow? Was it covered? Was the Litvinenko case covered in as well, maybe not as much depth, but in similar depth to your work for the New York Times?
I think that it was covered remarkably fully, because don't forget that there were a lot of journalists who didn't stick to the official line, who were investigative reporters.
Are they still with us?
Yeah, indeed. Some aren't, not on this particular story. A lot of reporters who covered sensitive business deals, defense-related contracts were killed.
Killed how? Drowned in fishing accidents? Or are we talking...
I think there was a particular case of one man who suddenly decided for no reason to go to the top floor of his apartment building and somehow fall out of a window.
Defenestration, another technique. Yeah. But so you tend to the theory that this was never intended to be discovered as an assassination.
I tend, if it was an assassination that was linked to a very clear effort to silence him or stop something that he was working on from ever coming to light, then it would make no sense to expose what had done it. The point about, indeed, the more you think about it, you wouldn't want something linked to a substance that's 97% produced in Russia.
If he was, in fact, I'm just having so much trouble getting my head around all the nuances here. If he was working for MI6, say, in the world of espionage, and I've seen a number of James Bond films, so I consider myself an authority. Is he not fair game for the Russian intelligence agencies? If he's come over here as a turncoat, very vocal, former KGB agent, defective, working for MI6, drawing a salary, is that not in the world of espionage? Does that make him fair game?
No, in fact, that protects him. I mean, that gives him the protection of being, there are declared agents and intelligence agents in all countries where the identity of people is known to the host nation. You don't, if he's just a renegade Russian dissident, that's one thing. I don't think it would necessarily be known to the Russian authorities that he was that he was on the payroll. If he had been, they would have had to think twice about this. Someone, would have had to make a call. Hey, we do this. You break one of the basic rules. Intelligence agencies don't take each other's agents out. They expel them. They do tit for tat. But the idea that you start a war by killing an agent, then someone else has got to kill you. I mean, that just doesn't happen.
Alan, do you speak Russian, or did you get all your information via a third party? Did you have to go through an interpreter?
I went through various interpreters, and what I did was I had my interviews taped, and then I played them back to a second or third interpreter who was not present at the interview, and asked them to transcribe them. So I was confident that the translations I was given at the time were in fact what was said.
Yeah, it's called doing your research diligently, and I'd expect nothing less from New York Times. Yes. Now, organised crime. I mean, there is a sort of maybe a simplistic theory that Russia basically is completely run by organised crime, leading straight up to the top, straight up to Mr. Putin. And you might as well call him the Godfather, I suppose. I mean, how accurate is that?
How do we know? I mean, that's assumed. It's the most frequent accusation, but it is unknowable, and perhaps it is known at the various highest levels of American or British intelligence. Certainly, the accusation is there. Equally, there are many people in the Kremlin in positions of great strength who do not necessarily operate and do everything.
But certainly organized crime plays a huge part in what's going on in Russia today, and the buying and selling of natural resources. And I'm sorry, but I keep coming back to the fact that so many Secret Service, former KGB agents went into the private sector immediately after the Soviet Union collapsed.
But that doesn't make them dishonest. I mean, are we going to say
they were opportunists?
Let's take one particular figure. Let's take the Alexander Litvinenko, who owns the Evening Standard and the Independent.
Yeah. And keeps them going. We're grateful
keeps them
to.
going.
Yeah.
And why would you assume that this man, because he was a KGB economics officer in the embassy in London, is now necessarily, involved in organized crime? Maybe he just seems to be.
Well, I don't trust the head of the CIA
businessman.
as far as I can throw him either. George Herbert Walker Bush as president and whatnot, and his, I believe the man's probably so crooked as Hunter Thompson used to say, had to screw his pants on in the morning. So we're talking about people who work in the shadows and are not subject to the scrutiny of your average politician. So when they move into, say, I don't know, selling billions of dollars worth of natural gas to Western Europe.
But I mean, look at people like Abramovich. He was never in the intelligence services, and he's an inordinately wealthy oligarch. I'm trying to think. Exception
or rule, sir?
Well, you've got two. I think you're looking at two different things here. There's the oligarchs. Who certainly, to my knowledge, were business types who then did very well out of the whole collapse of communism through a variety of means that maybe certainly would not stand up to outside scrutiny. I think what the other side of it is what about figures in the Kremlin who suddenly become directors of Aeroflot or big companies? Is that is that exclusively Russian? I'm not defending this practice at all for a minute, but I'm saying that I'm trying to cast my mind back, and I'm thinking, who were the very famous Russian oligarchs who had knowingly worked for the KGB? And certainly I don't think that applies to a lot of them.
If they were really good, we'd never know.
This is his last statement, which I think is very moving. You may succeed in silencing me, he wrote, but that silence comes at a price. You've shown yourself to be as barbaric and ruthless as your most hostile critics have claimed. You've shown yourself to have no respect for life, liberty, or any civilized value. You've shown yourself to be unworthy of your office, to be unworthy of the trust of civilized men and women. You may succeed in silencing one man, but the howl of protest from around the world will reverberate, Mr. Putin, in your ears for the rest of your life. May God forgive you for what you've done, not only to me, but to beloved Russia and its people. That is very moving. ultimately, though, what is the significance of this one man's death?
The significance was the fact that, and that was read out. I was there, and he, he was surrounded. The man who read it out, Alex Goldfarb, was surrounded by television cameras that were transmitting this around the world. The photograph of the iconic photograph of Litvinenko on his deathbed with it bald and looking bleak. That was taken by one of the big PR companies in London put that around the world free of charge to anybody who wanted to take it. This was a huge impact on Russia's reputation. I think that when Vladimir Putin was asked about this, I mean, he was nonplussed. I mean, as far as he was concerned, Alexander Litvinenko had been a minor KGB player who hadn't made it beyond colonel, whereas he had become director of the FSB and went on to be prime minister and president. He was an irritant, no more than that. And
it's not going to start another Cold War. I mean, I'm looking at the transcripts of stuff that is leading up to the opening of the inquest, and I'm starting to see signs of the state sort of closing in and closing ranks and thinking, actually, do we really want this to disturb relations and trade between our two countries? And the answer is probably no, isn't it?
But that's always been the case. I mean, that's always, from the very beginning, there's always been this balance that, if any government, any British government or American government who has to insist on a trial, has to insist on due process. Alexander Litvinenko was a British citizen killed on British soil, or he died on British soil. The accusation by the British Crown Prosecution Service is that he was murdered. So it wasn't just a simple murder. It wasn't a hit. It wasn't someone driving by with a Tokarev machine pistol. It was a devious, clever assassination.
Alan, I want to know where we can find you on the interwebs, please.
Well, I'm on Twitter. And I don't have a Facebook page, and I don't have a website.
Well, for obvious reasons. You don't want those Russians finding out where you are.
Or anybody else, for that matter. Yeah.
Ali, let's get an update from you, please, in the chat room.
I think in terms of your point about the Cold War, though, I think the cooling of relations has already happened, but this is bound to make things worse, is it not? I mean, the higher the profile, then the more that the damage is done, really. But you can't let that stop the justice going ahead, really.
I think you can't, but there are two aspects to there was the beginnings of a Cold War. Don't forget that just after this, when initially there were tit-for-tat expulsions of officers from Moscow and London, there was the whole affair of closing down the British Council. There was that weird business about British spies hiding microphones under a rock in Moscow and then being filmed, changing the batteries. I mean, it seemed incredibly clunky.
Crass, yeah.
So the trappings were there. We've spoken earlier about the number of very wealthy, powerful Russians in London who are central to the British property market. And they are woven into the fabric of our society. They own soccer teams, they own newspapers. I mean,
they own the last remaining independent bookseller in the UK.
The Evening Standard.
We're very grateful to them, actually, for that. Absolutely.
I think the most shocking thing about this whole interview, Alan, is the fact that as an Englishman, you use the word soccer freely, which comes as a great surprise, because that's an insult.
You're not going to be short of material to write about in the future years on this, are you? It's going to go on and on.
We'll see what happens with the inquest.
And do you safely expect anything to come out of MI6 during this inquest?
I think they'll have to testify. I think whoever testifies will testify in a way they can't be identified. But I think the pressure on them is to say something.
Fascinating, Alan. I'll just say, because Alan doesn't have a website or anything, but he has got quite an informative Wikipedia page. Alan Cowell. Just search for Alan Cowell Wikipedia, and we'll find your other books there too, won't we? And you've written some fiction.
And let's please plug the book, if we may.
Yeah, and the book is called
The Terminal Spy.
And it's published by?
It's published in this country by, and it's published by
Alan,
Doubleday.
you've got to get better at this.
I know, I'm hopeless.
Folks, he's actually looking at the book spine right now.
No, I'm looking at. It's published in the UK.
You are a beautiful man,
it's
sir.
It's published by Transworld.
I'm very impressed.
Good friends at Transworld. That's fantastic. Alan, thank you so much for being our guest tonight. It's been absolutely fascinating show.
That wasn't a gunshot in the background.
Oh, and just one quick question, just for my own sake. Two things. One, when Litvinenko was at UCL, I had a blood test, and I'm channeling my Aunt Sadie. But I was at that hospital. Now I shave every couple times every week with a razor to keep the scalp nice and tight. But will I ever be able to grow my hair again?
I was wondering why it's important like that. I don't think anyone can answer that.
I was there. I was at the hospital. I'm a little worried.
Alan, thank you so much. You haven't contributed a lot tonight, but what you have has been sheer quality.
Genius.
Yeah, and we're back up to speed this time next week with Dave Bartram, who we've missed sorely. So good night from us. Good night from Ian.
Hey, thanks everyone for listening.
Good night from Ali.
Good night.
And good night from Alan.
Good night.